What is going on, guys? It is me, Charles, with Chasing the Shutter, and today we're going to talk about aperture. Now, what is aperture? Aperture is something that every single photographer needs to know about as one of the three main pillars of photography. Now, the three main pillars are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now, we're going to get to shutter speed, and we're going to get to ISO in two totally different videos where I explain those in detail as well, but today is all about aperture. Now, technically speaking, aperture is the opening in the lens that lets light through. Now, the easiest way to think about this is like your own eyes. If you walk into a space and the light is really, really bright, then your pupils react. If it's really, really dark, your pupils expand and let more light through. Now, aperture works the exact same way. Now, the way we talk about aperture is a little strange. When we're talking about a large aperture, we're talking about a very small opening letting less light through. When we're talking about a small aperture, we're talking about a large opening letting a lot of light through. Now, this is a little counterintuitive to when you think large and small, but think of the number in which it's correlated with, right? So f16 is a small aperture because it's a fraction. Now, fractions, we all know, get smaller the bigger the denominator is, right? So if you have 1/16, that is a smaller amount than if you have 1/2, right? And so you think about it the same way. An f/2 is going to be a bigger amount than f/16, right? Because that f, think of that as the numerator spot, and think of the number as the denominator spot. So you have 1/2 and 1/16. Obviously, the 1/16 is going to be much smaller than that 1/2. Now, once you wrap your head around that, it becomes a little bit more simple on the fly. When you see that your lens has an f1.8 or an f4, which are some of the more commonly known ones, that means what is the largest aperture that they can possibly have. And they can usually go all the way down a whole bunch. Now, that presents its own sort of issues, and we'll talk about that in a bit, but when you have an f1.8, it's going to drastically change the look than if you're at f16. Now, the larger the aperture, the more focused on the foreground it's going to be. It means you're going to get that really beautiful bokeh that you see in a lot of these high-end portraits and stuff like that. But when you take landscape photography, you want a really small aperture at something like f16, maybe even f32, depending on the lens you're using. Once you can wrap your head around the large and the small and how flip-flop that is to your brain, you start to think, okay, well, how is it going to affect other parts of my shooting, right? So the two main things that aperture really messes with is exposure and depth of field, both crucial to take the photo that you want. Now, depending on your own style or the style that you're going for really determines what you're going to want. Do you want a shallow depth of field? Do you want a really large depth of field? Are you shooting nature? Are you shooting portraits? Do you want a nice bokeh? Do you want it all focused on the foreground, or do you want it to be really expanded? Do you want to let a lot of light in, or do you want to let just a little bit of light in? Now, shutter and ISO, those also come into play into making those change, but what does aperture affect those? Now, since aperture is how much light you're letting in, obviously that's going to affect exposure. Now, exposure, of course, is how much light and how less light you're getting in your photo. Now, if you have a really, really small opening, right, or a large aperture, you're going to be letting less light in. If you have a really large aperture, which is a whole lot bigger of an opening, you're going to have a lot more light coming in. If you're shooting in a dark environment, such as outdoors at night or indoors with, very dim lighting, you're going to want a large aperture, right? You want to be down at the f2, f4, right, somewhere in that range. If you have the lens to do it, f1.8, and that's going to let the most light in, which is going to give you the most detail when it comes to what you're going to see in the photo, right? If you have a really dark room, the more light you can let in, the more exposed the image is going to be, the more you're going to see. Now that we've talked about exposure, depth of field is probably the most important thing to think about when thinking about what aperture you want to be using. It has the most critical role when it comes to depth of field. If you have a really, really large aperture, such as f1.8, you're going to have a really thin or shallow depth of field. If you have a really small aperture, such as f32, then it's going to be a really large or wide depth of field. Now, this comes into play especially when you're doing something like portraits and landscape. Now, with landscape, you're going to have the foreground of your photo, you're going to have mountains in the background, maybe a sky that you want to capture is clear. How much do you want to have that be in focus, and how much do you want to be blurred or bokeh'd? Now, if you have a really long, expanding nature shot that you really want to capture, you're going to want to go with the really, really small aperture, f32, f16. A lot of people like to shoot f11 or higher when you're going nature, and that's to get all of the components of your shot in focus. You want all of those to be in your depth of field. But that's very different if you want to shoot a portrait. Now, if you're shooting a portrait and you want just the model's face in focus, then you want a really shallow depth of field. You just want this. You want everything behind them to be blurred out. You want the focus to be drawn into the face, the focal point of your shot. You're going to want a really thin or shallow depth of field, which is going to take a large aperture. Now, with prime lenses such as, say, a 50mm 1.8, you really get to see that specific bokeh look that a lot of portrait photographers are looking for when they do these kinds of shots. Now, if you have a group of people and you're shooting, say, wedding photos or engagement photos, and you're going to have more than one person, maybe you want a little bit of the background in, you don't want as much to be blurred out, you want a little bit more, you want to go with somewhere in the middle, which is where you get something like an f4, which is why it's probably the most commonly minimal side of the scale when you order a lens. Now, a lot of the 1855s that a kit is going to come with when you first start photography is going to be an f4. I know, for instance, back when like the T3i and the T5i, those were all coming out and they were the newest thing and they were cool little handhelds that didn't take up a lot of space or weren't heavy or complicated to work with, something like a Canon Mark IV, for instance, or a Canon Mark II. Even in like a 60 or 70 or 80D, those are a lot more complicated. People were buying these, but the kit lens that came with it was an 1855 f4. Now that means that you can't get smaller than that as far as number goes, right? You can't get a larger aperture on the scale. So no f2, no f1.8, but f4 is a really strong place to go, especially if you're starting. And when you take photos, like an engagement photo where there's more than one person, f4 is kind of the range. f4 to f8 are the really typical ranges that you want, because you are going to be blurring out a lot of the nonsense in the background, especially if there's like big venues or people in the background and stuff like that, and you really just want to capture them. You're going to have enough depth of field in that aperture range to capture them, both maybe a movement that they're doing, but you're not going to have to worry about a bunch of that background noise coming in and distracting from the main focus point, which is usually either the people getting married or the wedding party or whatever you're shooting that has a group of people. So, when you get to the smaller aperture end of the scale, f16, f32, there's a few things that can happen that can really kind of mess you up, especially depending on what you're shooting with. So if there's any dust on your lens, or it's raining out, maybe you have some water droplets on your lens that you haven't noticed because you're out shooting in the rain. Now, when you're something like an f4, f8, typically you're not going to see those in the photo. But when you get up to like an f16, f32, those are going to be kind of pronounced. And a lot of times you'll click it, you'll look down, and you'll go, what is in this shot? And that's usually because your depth of field is so wide that that little speck of dust and that little piece of water droplet on the lens is really, really, really coming into play, and it's actually noticeable. This is called diffraction. Now, diffraction if you're a science person and you really like physics or something like that, then you're going to know what diffraction means in the literal sense. Now, I'm not going to go into it on this video because we could be here a while, and I'll just make a video all about diffraction on its own. But the main point is that when it comes to aperture, not only it is a pillar building block of photography that you need to learn and you need to know and focus on and think about when you come into a shoot and how you're setting up, it's something that can really make a photo its own. Make sure that you're letting your artistic vision come through in your photos, because no one is taking that picture behind that camera but you. You are in control of the photo that you're taking, so you need to make sure that it's something that you love. And if you love a large depth of field, or you love really, really focaled in portraits, make sure that that comes into play when you're taking a shot. Make sure that you're thinking about aperture before every single photo you take. Now, of course, if you're in a studio and you set it all up and you're like, this is the aperture that I'm going to shoot at, and you're shooting 150 in the same location with your camera on a tripod, okay, you don't have to think about it every single shot. That's a bit of a stretch. But the main point is that aperture is something that you're keeping in your mind every single time you go out to shoot, because it makes a big difference in how your photo is going to turn out. Now, if you like this video, please give it a like, a comment, a subscribe. Let me know what you want to hear from next. I know that we're going to be doing shutter speed and ISO coming up here pretty soon. But if you have any other ideas of stuff that you want to know about, maybe a little bit more in depth, or a very specific thing about even aperture, or something that you think I should add to the video on shutter speed or ISO, please let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, subscribe. I'll be making videos every single week. Most of the time dropping around Friday or Saturday. So keep an eye out for them. Turn that notification bell on, and we'll see you guys next time. Again, my name is Charles, and this is Chasing the Shutter.